Lecture series. My name is Stephanie Street, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to the 22nd Frank and Kula Kumpuris Distinguished Lecture Series. Very pleased to see Dr. Drew Kumpuris with us here this evening. We're so very thankful to the Kumpuris family, and I'd also like to thank our other partners, AT&T and the Clinton School of Public Service, for their ongoing support. You know, this lecture series is really the product of a unique educational partnership that invests and encourages learning across a lifetime. I'd also like to welcome some other special guests that we have with us this evening, Governor Jim Guy Tucker and Betty Tucker. Former Secretary of Transportation Rodney Slater. Former Undersecretary of Rural and Community Development at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Bob Nash. Is Bob here yet? I know he was planning to be here. Arkansas Secretary of Agriculture, Wes Ward. And Little Rock City Director, Kathy Webb. Tonight, our special guest is the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Secretary Vilsack was appointed by President Barack Obama as the 30th Secretary of the USDA and sworn into office on January 21st, 2009. For 6 years under his leadership, the USDA has worked hard to strengthen the American agricultural economy, to revitalize rural communities, to protect and conserve our natural resources, and to provide a safe, sufficient, and nutritious food supply for the American people. He is a dedicated public servant and a very successful one, as he has never lost an election. That's pretty impressive. Yes, that does deserve a hand. Prior to his appointment, the Secretary served 2 terms as the Governor of Iowa, in the Iowa State Senate, and as the Mayor of Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Tonight, the Secretary is going to talk about the ongoing investments the USDA has made to expand rural opportunity, which, by the way, includes $23 billion in Arkansas alone. So, ladies and gentlemen, yes, that definitely deserves a round of applause. Please help me welcome the 22nd Kumpuris Distinguished Lecture Speaker, Secretary Tom Vilsack.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Stephanie, thank you very, very much, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon or this evening. It occurred to me that you all are to be congratulated and thanked for wanting to spend a Friday evening here listening to me. So I hope that you find the next hour or so worthwhile. I thought I'd set the stage briefly by reminding everybody why rural America matters. You know, as I talk to a lot of audiences across the United States, it occurs to me that they may not fully appreciate what rural America does for the country. Some of this is fairly obvious, and some of it's not. It's fairly obvious that rural America is the place where most of the food that we consume and use is produced. It's a place where a substantial amount of the water that we use and that we rely on in our day-to-day life is impacted and affected. It's the place where virtually all of the feedstock for most of the energy that we consume in this country emanates from. It's also the place where we see a disproportionate number of families send their sons and daughters into the military. The rural population today in America is roughly 15%. But yet it sometimes is anywhere from 35 to 40% of our military. It's an important place. All of that might be pretty obvious, but here's what may not be as obvious to all of you. Our farmers and our rural folks are so efficient at what they do in producing the food that we consume that when we walk out of a grocery store in this country, we walk out with more of our paycheck, more of our income than virtually anyone on earth. Only about 10% of our paychecks and our income is spent each year on food on average. That compares favorably in the developed world to 20 to 25%, and in the developing world it can be as high as 50 to 60% of a person's income. So we have this incredible freedom here in the United States as a result of the efficiency and the productivity of American farmers, most of which occurs in rural places. We have this ability to utilize that extra 10 to 15% of our income. Maybe we live in a nicer home. Maybe we take a nicer vacation or a longer vacation. Maybe we have a decent car to drive, or maybe we were able to put money aside for college or retirement. Brought to you by rural America. But every single person in this audience today, every single person in Little Rock today, in the state of Arkansas, in the United States of America that does not farm, that does not produce food for their family, and has pursued careers in politics or the law or in education or in medicine or science or engineering or carpentry or whatever, is able to do this because we've delegated the responsibility to feed our families to this incredible small group of Americans called the American farmer. Every one of us who's free to be, in my case, a lawyer, in my wife's case, a teacher, we have the capacity and the freedom to do this because we delegated the responsibility of feeding our family to a very small percentage of folks. In fact, when I was born in 1950, America was still very much a rural country. Roughly 100 million people or so in our population, roughly 25 million people farming. Today, we've seen agricultural production increase by 170% in my lifetime. We're using 26% less land to produce that 170% more, and we have 22 million fewer farmers than we did in 1950. In fact, if you really want to take a look at the major producers in this country, it's only about 250,000 farmers. They produce about 85% of what we grow, 1/10 of 1% of our population. It's an incredible story of innovation, of inspiration, and perspiration and risk-taking. But it's also had the impact of reducing the number of people who live, work, and raise families in rural communities. The mistake that was made for far too long in this country is that we didn't figure out that as we became more efficient with agriculture, that we needed to supplant that production agricultural economy with something that could surround it, that would give young people the opportunity to live, work, and raise their families in rural communities as well. Our extraction economy became so efficient that we just needed fewer people. And we didn't create new opportunities for those people who are no longer able to farm or willing to farm or needed to farm. We didn't give them the opportunity in a rural community to live, work, and raise families. So they moved to cities. So as a result, our country has become more urban. We're changing that now. We're providing for a more balanced approach. And it really begins with understanding what we need to do in rural communities and the serious challenges that we face in rural America. Because we didn't create that complementary economy, we've seen poverty rise in rural places. In fact, 85% of the persistently poor counties in this country are not urban. They are rural. Where 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 children generally in this country live in an impoverished home, it's 1 in 4 in rural America. So we've begun a process over the last 7 years since I've been secretary to begin building a complementary economy that's based on the natural resource advantages that we have in rural America, but complements our production agriculture, that gives us the opportunity to make the case that you can indeed live, work, and raise a family and pursue the American dream in rural America. Now, here's how we've done this. First of all, we needed to look innovatively at these persistently poor areas, recognizing that they weren't accessing the government programs to the level that they needed to, in part because they just didn't know how. I was struck by the notion of place-based initiatives when I toured the Clinton Library today, something that President Clinton, I think, introduced into the thought process in terms of government services, focusing on specific places. Well, we've taken that concept and we've drilled down a bit at USDA. We created, with the assistance of Pearlie Reed, who just recently passed away, and my heart goes out to his family. But Pearlie and I realized that it was necessary to really focus intensive care on those persistently poor areas. So with Pearlie's help and a number of other folks at USDA, we created a thing called Strike Force. And we started it in Arkansas, in Georgia, and in Mississippi. And the theory was that we would go down and identify the counties where persistent poverty was most significant, and we would take a team of USDA officials that would include our farm service folks, our rural development folks, our natural resource conservation folks, and our food and nutrition folks, and ask them to partner with a community building organization, identify the needs of a particular area, and try to use USDA programs to meet those needs. Now, we've designated in the state of Arkansas 48 counties where they became Strike Force counties. We sent our teams down. We've partnered with 41 different organizations in those counties. And over the course of the last 4 or 5 years since we started this process, we've invested nearly $500 million in those counties. Now, all told, the Strike Force is now expanded to 21 states, over 900 counties. And since its inception, we've done 190,000 different investments in those counties, about $23 billion that is now providing assistance and help, and teaching folks how basically to access federal programs. We didn't stop at just USDA. President Obama, was so impressed with the work that we were doing at USDA, he asked what else we could do and should do. And with his guidance and leadership, we created the Rural Council, which I chair. And it's all of the federal agencies that are engaged and involved in rural America. And the theory behind that was to try to work collaboratively to break down the silos so that we would focus our time, attention, and resources on rural areas. We began initially by focusing on economic opportunity. I'll give you a couple of examples of what we've done in the Rural Council. We created a Made in Rural America initiative designed to make sure that small businesses in rural America understood the export opportunities that existed. Sometimes I think small businesses think they can't participate in the export opportunities, but when you think about it, 95% of the consumers in the world live outside the U.S. And if all we do is business with ourselves, we're really shortchanging our opportunity. So we created programs and assistance and even insurance programs to ensure payment for small businesses within 30 days when they do business overseas, creating opportunities with our Made in Rural America Export Initiative. We looked at the creative opportunities in the biofuel sector, and we realized that the Department of the Navy was very interested in making sure that we embraced for the Defense Department the use of biofuels. Now, the reason they did was pretty obvious. When they look at their Pacific Theater, the ships and planes that participate in activities and protect our West Coast, they realized that a lot of the energy source, a lot of the fuel for that fleet, for those planes, came through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you don't know where the Strait of Hormuz is, I encourage you to take a look at your atlas or map or Google it tonight and ask yourself whether you feel confident and safe about the oil that your sailors and airmen depend on traveling through that strait. Whether you see the countries that are bordering that strait, whether they are friendly to the United States. I think you'll conclude that it makes a lot of sense to try to figure out how to produce fuel in Arkansas that can be used in those jets and planes and ships rather than the Strait of Hormuz. So the Navy basically challenged us. So the Navy, the Department of Energy, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for the first time ever, entered into an agreement in which we are creating an industry that did not exist, which is a drop-in aviation fuel industry and a drop-in marine fuel industry. The ability to take landfill waste, woody biomass, crop residue, and convert it into a drop-in, not a blended, a drop-in fuel. Now, just recently, I was in the Pacific Ocean on the USS Livingston, which was a destroyer. It was being refueled with a blended fuel made from beef tallow from the Midwest. That's the future, and that's going to create opportunities for both farmers and for processing and manufacturing. So the Rural Council has given us that opportunity to sort of work collaboratively. And most recently, we started a child poverty initiative where we're looking at innovative and creative ways to deal with poverty and the impact on children. Most recently, the President has asked the Rural Council and myself to participate in our effort to reduce the reliance on opioids, pain medications, and the addictions that are really crippling people in rural America. The suicide rate and the poisoning rate is dramatically higher in rural areas. And so it's important for us to really focus on trying to reduce the reliance that Americans now have on these opioids. So there's a lot of work happening in a very innovative and creative way. But the strategy for rebuilding the economy basically involves four concepts, four strategies, four pillars, if you will. The first pillar must always be production agriculture and the capacity that we have in this United States to be able to be a food secure nation, to be able to lead the world in exports, to continue to create more, because nearly 1 million jobs are supported through the exports that we do in agriculture. So we obviously want to continue to support production agriculture, and we want to continue to look for export opportunities. It's one of the reasons why the President is supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an opportunity for us to continue to do business and expand business with an amazingly increasing middle class in Asia. Just consider this one fact about that opportunity. Today, there are roughly 535 million middle-class consumers in Asia. These are folks who are able to afford and want to purchase items, high-value items, that are produced and made in the United States and grown in the United States. In just 15 years, it's projected that that number of 535 million will be increased by 2.7 billion people. So that means that there will be over 3 billion people in Asia alone who are middle-class consumers who are prepared to potentially to purchase American goods and products, who want American goods and products, and who will need the protein in particular that we're able to produce here in the U.S. That's 10 times the population of the U.S., just in one area of the world. So obviously we want to encourage support for production agriculture and exports. We complement that with our local and regional food system effort. This is an opportunity, in part, to allow smaller operators the chance not to necessarily sell their products on a commodity-based market where they have no control over the price that they receive. We've invested nearly $1 billion in over 40,000 investments in a local and regional food system that will allow farmers to be able to negotiate directly with their customer, to establish a price for their product. It may be that they sell to a local school. It may be that they sell to a local university or hospital, or a farmer's market, or a food hub, or a restaurant, or a series of restaurants. There are now 162,000 producers in the country that are participating in this part of our economy in rural America. When we started this, it was about a $5 billion industry. Today, the latest numbers has it about $12 billion, and it's projected by the year 2019 to be a $20 billion industry. Just think about farm to school. We know today that over 5,000 school districts are already purchasing locally produced goods. About $750 million or so is being purchased locally, but it's a $3 billion market. And we also know that every time we create places where this locally produced food is aggregated, food hubs, we're helping to support 20 jobs. 20 jobs in a small town makes a big difference. So it's production, agriculture, and exports, it's local and regional food systems, and we've created a whole series of ways to help, from microloans to extending the growing season through tunnel houses, expanded market opportunities, risk management tools to enable those smaller producers to have the same protection that commodity producers have against the vagaries of Mother Nature. So it's a comprehensive effort, and most recently we established 8 value chain coordinators that will be looking at ways in which we can link more effectively and efficiently producers who are local and regional with customers who are interested in purchasing. And we're seeing a growing interest in this area. It also, by the way, helps young farmers, beginning farmers, folks who may not be fortunate enough to inherit a farm or be part of a farming operation. It gives them a more easy entryway into farming so we can replenish our farm population. We have an aging farming population in this country, and it's something that concerns me, which is why we've spent a lot of time recruiting women, returning veterans, people of color, to get into the business of farming, to complement the great farmers that we have today. The third aspect of this is conservation. And we normally think of conservation as ways in which we can invest in better land and better water, and in the stewardship that farmers traditionally have embraced. But we're now seeing new opportunities for conservation. To the extent that we can expand habitat, we can also expand hunting and fishing and biking and hiking opportunities. Outdoor recreation is an over $640 billion industry in the United States. It employs millions of people, and there's no reason why we can't use our conservation programs to focus on expanding opportunities that will encourage those tourism dollars to be spent in rural areas. There's also an opportunity with a changing climate. As we look at companies that are regulated in terms of their emissions, or corporations that are interested in having as part of their social responsibility some response to changing climate, we're now creating what are called ecosystem markets, where those regulated industries or those corporations who are interested in their social responsibility are now investing and purchasing conservation results. We're able to now measure, quantify, and verify the activities that farmers take on their farms in terms of conservation, the sequestering of carbon, water quality, habitat expansion, and we're creating local markets that creates a new income source for farm families and a new set of opportunities for contractors who obviously are engaged and involved in establishing the conservation benefit. We're seeing great interest in this, and there's now literally hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in these ecosystem markets. Two quick examples. Chevrolet recently invested a substantial amount of money in a working ranch in North Dakota to sequester carbon to satisfy a social responsibility criteria that they've established for their corporation. In Oregon, there's a power company that basically takes water out of a stream and uses it to produce the power, and then it puts it back in the stream. The quality of the water is exactly the same. In fact, it may even be better. The problem was it was a little warmer. The salmon didn't like the warm water. So the company was faced with having to build some kind of cooling apparatus. They chose to think creatively and outside the box to create this new economy in rural America. And instead of building gray infrastructure, they decided to invest in green infrastructure. They thought if they planted shade trees along that stream, they could naturally lower the temperature of the water. They would provide new income sources for the landowners. They would provide a buffer from the cropland that would protect the quality of the water. They would make sure the salmon were happy, and of course they would end up spending a lot less money, both in terms of maintaining those trees and in having not to build that gray infrastructure. So production, agriculture, and exports, local and regional food systems, conservation, ecosystem markets, and tourism. And then the final piece of this is the bio-based economy. I mentioned it earlier in terms of the fuels that the Navy is beginning to figure out how to use, but the reality is it's not just fuel, it's not just energy. It's actually literally thousands of products that can be produced that are bio-based, from waste material, from crop residue, from grasses that are grown in great abundance in parts of this country, from woody biomass, new and creative ways to use what we grow and what we raise. Most recently, we just sponsored a tall wood building contest. We took $1 million of rural development resources and we challenged the architects and engineers of the country to think about how they might be able to use wood more effectively as a building material, not for single-family homes, which we traditionally think of, but for multi-story buildings. Now you might think, well, that's a tough sell. Obviously, when you build with wood, you've got a greater fire hazard. Well, actually, that's not the case. With cross-laminated timber, a new process that allows timber to be sort of pressed together, sort of like plywood, you can create structural materials that are as strong or stronger than the traditional building materials and are more fire retardant. In fact, these, the cross-laminated timber will char in intense heat. It won't collapse as was the case with cement, and it won't melt as is the case with steel. And we put this $1 million, the Softwood Lumber Council and Board matched that with $2 additional million, and now over the course of the next several years, you're going to see a 10-story building in New York City and a 12-story multiple-purpose building being constructed in Portland. And we think there's an opportunity here for a brand new industry that didn't exist in the U.S. Not only can it take diseased wood, of which we have a great abundance in the western part of the U.S., and convert it into a structural material, but of course it creates an opportunity for incredibly attractive architecture. It's not just building materials, it's chemicals, it's fabrics, it's fibers, it's solvents, it's cleaners, it's uniforms. It's a wide array. In fact, we have over 10,000 products that the United States government encourages agencies to purchase that are bio-based under our BioPreferred program. We're labeling our bio-based products so that consumers will be able to know that they're helping local farmers and rural communities by purchasing a product that is bio-based. Most recently, Tide announced that part of their detergent will be a new bio-based and will be able to receive that bio-based label from the USDA. So when you combine this and when you understand that that bio-based economy is today employing nearly 4 million people, you see that there's a tremendous hope and opportunity in rural America to be able to rebuild, revitalize, and restructure the economy based on our natural resource advantage. Let me just leave you with this. It's a story that I tell in a number of audiences because I think it underscores why all of this is important. Beyond the jobs, beyond farm income, beyond more of the traditional notions of how we think about rural America. This comes from my experience as a governor, and the former governor understands and appreciates what this is all about. When you are governor, you are also the commander-in-chief of your National Guard, which means that you have responsibility for these brave men and women who are willing to put themselves at risk when there's a flood or a natural disaster in your state to basically protect the citizens. For the last 10 to 15 years, our National Guards have had an additional responsibility. They've had to travel to Iraq and Afghanistan, put themselves in harm's way. And when you're the governor, you basically are involved in sending those folks off to war and welcoming them back. Sending them off is a heartbreaking experience as you watch families being separated. Welcoming them back is one of the most heartwarming experiences that you have because you see fathers who have never seen a child before, who was born while they were gone. You see parents relieved that their son or daughter has come home whole and healthy and alive. But there are times when unfortunately and tragically people do not come home. And in my case as governor, 41 Iowans did not come home. At one point we had the highest mortality rate within our National Guard of any state in the country. And as governor, you have to reach out to those families. You have to express your sympathies. You have to acknowledge their service and their sacrifice. It is by far, in my view, the toughest thing I had to do as a governor. I tell the story of one conversation I had because I think it underscores why all of this is important. Bruce Smith was a sergeant in the National Guard. He had been in the National Guard for over 20 years. He was one of the older fellows in the National Guard. Came from a small town, West Liberty, town of about 3,000 folks. Married for over 20 years, lovely wife, 2 children who were going through school at the time. And Bruce had had not 1, not 2, but this was his 3rd tour of duty in the National Guard. He was a helicopter pilot, and his job was to ferry people from one neighborhood in Baghdad to another. At the time he served, Baghdad was so dangerous that you literally couldn't drive from one neighborhood to another. You had to actually ferry troops by helicopter. On one fateful day, the helicopter he was operating was hit with a handheld missile. And as the Adjutant General of the National Guard advised me, when he advised me of Bruce's death, he said Bruce had a split-second decision to make in the operation of that helicopter to the extent that he still had any maneuverability left. He could put himself and his co-pilot at greater risk and save potentially the folks in the back. Or he could potentially increase his chances and his co-pilot's chances of survival, but put the folks in the back at greater risk. He did what he was trained to do. He did what you would expect a National Guardsman to do. He did what he was taught to do in rural America. He put himself and his co-pilot at greater risk in the hopes of saving people in the back. On that day, 17 people walked away from that helicopter alive. My job was to call his wife and talk to his wife. As Secretary Slater knows, we give a lot of speeches, do a lot of talking. That is hard. And as I was talking to this wonderful woman, I realized that no matter what I said, it sounded sort of shallow. It sounded as if it didn't have substance. It sounded as if I was just mouthing the words of sacrifice and thoughts and prayers. And this wonderful woman realized I was struggling, and she interrupted me in the middle of my sentence, and she said, Governor, I've got this figured out. And this was amazing to me because she had just learned in the last 24 hours that her life was turned upside down, that she, without a full-time job, was now going to be responsible for raising these 2 kids. She had lost her husband. I couldn't figure out how anybody could have that figured out. Here's what she said. She said, Governor, the way I've got it figured, those 17 people needed Bruce more in that split second than I'll need him the rest of my life. And I tell you that story because it's about 2 individuals from rural America. One, a fellow who didn't have to go back, who didn't have to do multiple tours of duty, but did it because he believed that he had a responsibility of defending his country, of providing protection for his friends and neighbors back home. And he did it willingly. And he did it knowing the risks. He came from rural America. The young lady, she too understood that sometimes this country asks and should ask all of us for sacrifice and something back. But sometimes it asks significantly more from a few of us. And she too was willing to make that sacrifice for the country. That's why it's important to have a vibrant rural economy, so that we continue to have folks who think that way and feel that way, who understand the significance and importance of giving things back. I think that's alive and well in the small towns that I visit in my home state of Iowa, and I'm sure that as I tour small towns in Arkansas, I would find the same thought process, and I'm sure that if I go to any one of the 50 states, I would find people just like Bruce and Mrs. Smith. So I'm here today to tell you that we are very focused on making sure that the families like the Smith family are able to say to their sons and daughters that you don't have to travel. You can if you want, but you don't have to travel. You aren't forced to leave that small town or small towns like the one you grew up in. That we've got a government and we've got people in government who understand the importance of it and are working hard every day to make sure that there's opportunity. I happen to be very optimistic about the future of rural America. I think we have extraordinary people. I think agriculture has an incredible opportunity in front of it. But I do believe that we have to complement production agriculture. And I think we're on the right road. And I think we've got the right tools. We just have to continue to make the investment because the people and the place is worth it. So with that, I will stop and take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We on here? Yep, we're on. All right. Questions from anyone? Please raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you.
Fell in the back there.
Where's back here in the back?
He was right. He was right.
There he is. Oh, this guy's a good questioner.
Thanks. I grew up on a farm 40 miles north of here. Still live there. Going to die there. And the question I have is, there were many people in our area that were positively affected by the natural gas industry. You had some people who were land rich, but cash poor, and others who had to leave. And I'm wondering how can, since there's such a supply of natural gas in our state and other states, how can that be incorporated into the Rural America Plan?
Well, it's a great question, and I think, I was told that I was supposed to talk about 20 minutes. I could probably talk 20 hours on this. Part of that natural resource advantage that we have are the renewable resources and the energy resources that are available. And certainly to the extent that whether it's renewables or natural gas create economic opportunity, they should be done in a sustainable and appropriate way. And I don't think there's any question that we have to embrace sort of an all-of-the-above strategy on energy. We're enjoying less expensive energy costs today, which is helping particularly our farmers get through a tough time. Prices aren't as high as they used to be, and fortunately, we don't have really high fuel costs at this point or fertilizer costs because of less expensive oil and petroleum. Well, part of the reason we have that is because we are expanding and providing competition for those energy dollars. And part of the opportunities that I see is in the renewable energy area. You know, I just got an email from energy company executive in Iowa. They just announced, Mid-American Energy just announced another $3.3 billion to invest in wind energy. And that means they will have invested $10 billion in Iowa. Now, once they get finished with these wind farms that they want to build, 85% of the energy needs in Iowa for this company will be met by wind. Now, here's what you need to know about wind. First of all, there's payment that's made to farmers for the land. They lease the land for the turbines. Each one of those turbines has 8,800 parts. And the reality is somebody's got to make those parts. And these things are huge. And it makes no sense to make them in Denmark, put them on a ship, and bring them over to the U.S. It does make a lot of sense to have them produced here in the U.S. And then, you know, occasionally things like that break, so you have to have people that can repair them. So there's a whole different supply chain of job opportunities based on this renewable energy source, and the same thing true of natural gas. We just have to make sure that we do it in a thoughtful, strategic way, that we don't have over-reliance on one type or another, because the reality is we were far too reliant on oil for far too long, and most of the oil we were relying on was coming from someplace else. So we're taking our hard-earned bucks and sending them over to the Middle East. Doesn't make sense to me. I'd like to keep our hard-earned dollars here.
Question. The lights are.
Well, the lights are very bright.
The lights are bright, so if you wave your hand. Yes, sir, right here. Here's a quick, we'll get the microphone to you. Yeah. Pass it in, yeah.
Well, that's a kind of a dangerous thing. You press that white microphone, people have like 8 questions there in that row.
You know, during the current presidential race, there's been a lot of talk about trade, and in particular limiting trade between nations. And as an exporter of rice and other agricultural products, that's of real interest to us. What is your position on that, and how do you see this thing unfolding?
Geez, I didn't know we were having a presidential lunch, so kind of busy with my job. Hey.
We can tell you about it around here.
Yeah, I'm sure you can. Remember, I'm from Iowa, so I absolutely know. You know, first of all, you start off with a statistic that we are 5% of the consuming global population. So it means 95% of the customers are someplace else. So from a sort of common sense standpoint, if you're in a business and you basically say, I don't want to sell to 95% of the possible customers, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Then when you realize that agriculture has become incredibly productive, more so than, you know, we produce way more than we need for our own needs, which, by the way, is another benefit from agriculture. We have national security advantage because we can feed ourselves. Chinese can't feed themselves. They couldn't possibly feed themselves today or in the foreseeable future. They just don't, I don't care what they do with their agriculture. They're always going to be reliant on people like us. The trade agreement that I referred to is not just about opportunity and business opportunity. Agriculture, I will tell you, the Farm Bureau has done an analysis, the Peterson Institute's done an analysis. We're talking about billions of dollars more income, billions of dollars of more trade opportunities, and every $1 billion of ag trade generates another 6,500 jobs. So we're talking about jobs, and these jobs, by the way, pay about 18% more than non-export, non-trade related jobs. So with due respect to all of the presidential candidates, all of them seem to say, you know, in one form or another, you know, they don't like this agreement or they don't like that agreement. I think that's an easy thing to say in a presidential campaign, but the reality is that if we stop trading, we would put ourselves not only at economic risk, we would also put ourselves from a national security perspective. Our ability to balance China's influence in Asia is not going to be based on the Pacific Fleet. It's going to be based on our economic power. I mean, I think people have to realize that the whole notion of military power and military dominance, which maybe 50, 60 years ago was how you basically created the alliances and how you created security, has now been complemented in a very significant way by economic power. And economic power involves investment, it involves various relationships, buyer-seller relationships, but it absolutely involves trade. Then when you think of the opportunities that we have, not just in Asia, but 90 miles off our shore here, with due respect, we tried the embargo of Cuba for 60 years. 60 years. I've been down there twice in the last 6 months. I don't think much has changed in 60 years in terms of their government. I think it's pretty much the same crew. So let's try something different. Let's try introducing American opportunity. Let's try exposing these people to the amazing diversity of American agriculture, and let's see if we can trade. Now, I know that they need our rice. I know they need our poultry. I know they need our soybeans. And frankly, we potentially could use their organic products because they haven't done much with their land. It's a two-way street. It's how you build trusting relationships. And you know, if we build a trusting relationship with Cuba, it's not just Cuba that we impact Central America, we impact South America. We become a much more secure hemisphere. So my view is we should be promoting trade. Now, yes, there needs to be labor standards and you need to protect the environment and all of the other things that people talk about. The TPP agreement's unique because for the first time we actually have labor standards in the agreement with enforceable trade sanctions. The first time we ever had environmental standards with enforceable. We're asking Vietnam, now think about this. Think about this. We're asking Vietnam, a communist country, to allow collective bargaining. And they're willing to do that in this trade agreement. Now, if we decide, you know what, we're just going to do business with ourselves, we're going to build a wall, figuratively speaking, around the country, and we're not going to trade with anybody. Here's the problem. The rest of the world's going to trade with each other. We're going to be shut out. We're not going to be able to set the standards. If you're truly interested in labor and environment, who would you rather have setting those standards in Asia? The United States or China? Seems to me you can always, say something can be better, and if it can be, work at making it better. But at the end of the day, I think we need trade, and right now with prices what they are, we've got a surplus of a lot of stuff. We need more market opportunities, and we need to create economies and this is my last point. We don't have to be worried about competition in the sense that over the course of the next 35, 40 years, there's going to be an incredible demand for food because the global population is going to increase. It's going to increase to 9 to 10 billion people. To feed that many people, we're going to have to increase productivity globally by 70%. That will require as much innovation, I'm told, in the next 35 years as we've had in the previous 10,000 years in agriculture. There's plenty of business opportunity here. It's not like we're going to necessarily be, if we trade or we're going to be knocked out by the competition. No, America's going to win that competition more times than not. So I don't know. We shouldn't be fearful. We should be looking at the future, I think, in an optimistic and hopeful way. That's my view.
Great answer.
Governor Tucker.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your remarks. We're sure happy to have you here in Arkansas. This is a question about trade and about new technology and focusing particularly on the concerns about genetically modified organisms and our food sources.
Yeah.
Human food animals, cattle, pigs, chickens, carry a lot of diseases that affect humans, E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Miri, and so forth. We are withdrawing vaccines or withdrawing antibiotics from use in those animals for a wide variety of what I think are good reasons. Vaccines have been created that are genetically modified vaccines. And will those become a prohibited GMO export? Will they affect our trade? Is it something the Department of Agriculture is trying to assist in creating such vaccines in order to provide a fallback from the lack of antibiotics?
Wow, that's a really complicated question.
From one governor to another.
You're right, yeah. Governor, let me try to break it down a little bit. Let me start with the GMO, just generally speaking. It is my view that we are not going to be able to feed the increasing world population without embracing science and technology and the advances that science and technology can provide in productivity. It is my view that genetically modified mechanisms will be part of that science and part of that technology. I am highly critical of the seed companies and the folks who introduced this technology into our agriculture at the outset because they failed to understand the necessity of speaking to consumers as well as to producers. Had they done that, then the void that was created by not doing it, which is now allowing some folks who are opposed to this technology to in my view, redefine or misdefine the risks associated with GMOs. They've given them sort of an open shot. I was just in Europe last week and was talking to the French about this whole issue of how we provide for greater food safety. And, you know, we have an issue with how we treat our poultry, and they don't agree with it. But yet their Campylobacter rates are significant, I mean, like 3, 4, 5 times what ours are. So I think it is important for us to have a conversation internationally in the international organizations to have a understanding about the role science has to play. There have to be regulations and regulatory processes that ensure that the safety of whatever we decide to put in the marketplace, it's safe, it's not going to create risk. But we need to do a much better job of educating people, and we have to do a much better job of educating our foreign friends on precisely why we believe this is appropriate. We just went through a heck of a deal with the avian influenza, and you know, knock on wood, we get through the spring without a significant reoccurrence. We're creating a vaccine now for that. Of course, the problem is it mutates and it changes, and it's like one step ahead. But and there's disagreement within the industry as to whether or not we should use it because of the impact that using it will have on our trading partners. Our trading partners will assume that the entire poultry industry in the United States, in all 50 states, is impacted by the fact that we might have used vaccine in Arkansas or in Iowa. We didn't use it anyplace else, but they will ban all of our poultry. So there is a real education process that's underway. And the Department of Agriculture has a role. But it's not just the Agriculture Department. It's other agencies of government, I think, who also have to be speaking. We have to speak with a single voice, and frankly, we don't do a particularly good job of that. Some agencies will say this, the EPA will say one thing, USDA will say something else. The science and technology person at the White House might have a different view, and then the congressional committees. And land-grant university, everyone's got kind of a different opinion about this. We've got to figure out a way to harmonize our message in a way that educates. We're now having a huge conversation in the Congress about whether we should label products that contain GMO. Now, when we label in the United States, historically we label for one of two reasons. We either label to give you nutritional information, how many calories something contains, what the protein content is, fat content, and so forth. Or we give you a heads up about a known risk. You got a peanut allergy, may not want to eat this product because it's got peanuts. Those are the two reasons, nutrition, risks. When folks say we need to label a product that's got GMO, we're now talking about labeling for the process that was used in producing the food. Well, that's endless. That is endless, right? And what I've suggested is we need to give consumers the information they want because the consumer's always right and these companies want to satisfy their customers. But we've got to do it in a way that doesn't send the wrong impression about the safety of the product. That's why I suggested that an expanded QR code or a barcode with smartphone technology and scanners will give you the ability as a company to give consumers who are truly interested in all this as much information as is possible about the product, how it was produced, where it came from. You know, is this U.S. produced? Is it some material from some other country? The process. But you do it in a way that doesn't necessarily say, hey, this product may be unsafe, or you better watch out because this product contains something, you know, that we're not quite sure about. That's the challenge. I think we also have to recognize that Mother Nature is a force, and she's constantly evolving. And our regulatory processes and our science seems to be one step behind her in agriculture. Our regulatory processes internationally are not synchronized and take far too long. When I came into office, we took 90 months to review a petition to deregulate a particular GMO trait. Today, we're down to 18 months, and I think we'll eventually get down to 13 months. But as soon as we get something approved, we can't actually use it because our Chinese friends have not yet given the okay. So our producers are a little worried, and our shippers are a little worried that if we start producing in the U.S., they'll be commingling. The Chinese will say at the border, at the port, we're not going to accept that entire container full of corn because it contains, you know, four kernels of a different crop that we haven't approved. So they are basically stifling innovation. And we have impressed upon them the need for synchronization of regulatory process. And we've stressed on the part of our European friends the need to have an acceptance and understanding of GM, GM approaches. I'm all for organic. I think it's great. High value added, terrific. We want more organic in this country. We have tremendous demand for it. But don't ask me to choose between the two, because I don't think I should have to. I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but it's
You've got a
as good as
question
I can
over
do.
here.
And those lights are bright, aren't they?
They are right, yeah.
First, Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for a REAP grant that we received for one of our digester projects. And then I want to follow up with perhaps if you would explain a little bit more about the Biogas Roadmap and where that's taking us on rural energy.
The Biogas Roadmap was an effort on our part to try to figure out how we could create a understanding of how to build the supply chain from production to distribution to use. One of the reasons that we put the Biogas Roadmap together was, I'll give you two reasons. One, the dairy industry was particularly interested in working with us to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They were very proactive from an agricultural perspective by saying that they wanted to reduce their emissions by, I think, 25% by the year 2020 across the entire supply chain, which meant that they had to figure out ways to capture the methane that was being produced by the dairy cow and or reduce it either through feed additives that would reduce the methane or capture it and convert it through anaerobic digesters. So we pledged to help finance these anaerobic digesters, and we've, depending upon the number, Kathy Cochran's going to get me a number one of these days, I hope, or Melinda's going to get me a number. Sleps going to get me, one of those two young ladies is going to get me a number. Well,
Nothing like being put on the spot.
It's a running joke in our department. We have two numbers, and for whatever reason, we're trying to figure out how to reconcile them. I think we've done about one a week since we made this pledge. And we've invested in over 8,000 renewable energy projects of one form or another since I've been secretary. So part of it was to help the dairy industry. The other aspect of this was the commercial aviation industry. I mentioned the Defense Department was interested in drop-in aviation fuel. As interested as the Defense Department is, the commercial aviation industry is really interested in it. They'd like to have a drop-in aviation fuel because they have emission requirements that they have to meet internationally. And the drop-in aviation opportunity is, you know, when you try to sell biofuel, as Rodney Slater knows, there are like, I don't know, how many gas stations are there in the country? Rodney, you used to know this. Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. He lost his staff too.
Yeah. I think there are a couple 100,000 gas stations. So you got to try to convince the oil industry to give you the opportunity to sell a product that competes with their product, and there are hundreds of thousands of gas stations. It's tough. It's hard. And we're trying to do that. We're offering incentives. We're trying to encourage higher blends and so forth. But with commercial aviation, it's 40 airports sell 90% of the jet fuel. So you have to just sell 40 places. So it's a 17 to 19 billion gallon market opportunity. So the Biogas Roadmap is a way of trying to figure out how do we get from concept of helping these commercial aviation industry to a point where they're purchasing 1 billion gallons, 2 billion gallons, 3 billion gallons, eventually 10, 15 billion gallons, creating economic opportunity within the U.S. It also creates a series of mileposts for us to check and see whether we're on the right track or not. So that's the purpose of it, and it fits in nicely with our climate change initiative, where we think agriculture can reduce its emissions, contribute to the overall emission reduction within the U.S., which in turn has led the international community to make significant commitments. Part of the way we do that is by embracing renewable energy of one form or another, including digesters.
We have a question on the back row, back here, the very back row, and this is going to be our last question. So we'll hopefully people can say after the speech is over and say hello. But.
Hi, I'm a student at Hendrix College, and I'm a graduating senior, and I actually did some research on the environmental implications of agriculture in both the US and Europe. And it's obvious that industrial agriculture, both crop production and livestock production, does degrade the environment, and I think we know that, and I think many countries around the world are working to ensure that those damages are mitigated. But I was wondering if there are policy options, because I know there's food waste reduction initiatives and there's been conservation options within like the Agricultural Act. But if there are any types of policy options or mitigation strategies that are being adapted from both places like Denmark or other places in Europe in order to apply to the United States that might benefit productivity in general, because we're speaking about hunger and food security, and I think it's very important to look at those environmental impacts that production does have.
Okay. The complexity of your question, I feel like I need to know if you're related to the governor here. That's quite a question. Let me start by making sure that you and I are on the same wavelength here. I think you can look at studies that indicate that agriculture, because of increased productivity, is having an impact on the environment. But I think you have to look at the progress that's now being made by producers around the country. The reality is, if you look at it on a per acre basis, and you look at the amount that's being produced per acre, we're using a lot less chemicals and pesticides per bushel than we were. And part of that is science. Now, is there more work to be done? Absolutely. We've got a record number of acres enrolled in conservation today than ever before. Does more have to be done? Absolutely. So here's what we are trying to do. First of all, we're trying to be smarter about conservation. It isn't enough for me to go to an individual farmer and say, hey, what kind of things would you like to do on your land that we could cost share, that we could pay 50% of the cost for, and have him or her identify a couple of things that we would do. That's great, except that it doesn't move the dial. What moves the dial on an individual farm is a suite or combination of conservation practices. So we actually have to have a plan that embraces a number of conservation actions, and we need to make sure that those actions are consistent with what we're doing on the neighbor's farm and the neighbor's neighbor's farm and the neighbor, all the way through the watershed. So we have decided at USDA to take a watershed, large landscape scale approach to conservation as opposed to an individual farmer by farmer. We're still doing business with farmers, we're still providing the cost share, but we're doing it in a planned and strategic way that will allow us to get better conservation results for the dollars we're spending. We're doing this through a number of different ways, one of which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, where we're also encouraging others who have an interest in better stewardship to put their money into this process as well. It's a societal good, and we need to partner with the farmers. It's government, it's NGOs, it's farmer, putting more resources into conservation doing suites of practices instead of individual one-off practices, and doing it in a coordinated fashion. That's one thing. Secondly, we're doing research. Howard Buffett came and spoke to our Outlook Forum. Howard is a farmer. Is Warren Buffett's son, but he's very, very involved in conservation. And he made the case that conservation can be profitable to producers. And the case he was making is that with the use of cover crops and crop diversity, multiple cropping systems, not just corn, beans, which we do in a lot of parts of the country, but maybe 3 or 4 crops in rotation, that you can actually over time be more financially stable and more financially profitable, which in turn will provide greater contribution to the health of the soil, which in turn creates obviously better stewardship and more productive soil. So we're now in the process, as part of our building block, and I mentioned this earlier about sequestration, we're now, as part of that, a major part is a soil health campaign. And we have tools that we've created for farmers so that they can absolutely calculate the impact of certain farming practices in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of impact on the soil and soil health, so that they can make informed decisions. And we're providing incentives and information and research projects as to how we might become more diverse in the crops that we're producing. We're also analyzing the impact of climate on agriculture. It's not a static circumstance and situation. We cannot assume that what we're growing today in Arkansas we're going to grow tomorrow or 40 years from now. The fact is that's going to change. So we have a series of climate hubs where we're analyzing the vulnerabilities of both agriculture and forestry in every region of the country, and then we're identifying strategies for producers to be able to adapt and mitigate to the impacts of climate. And part of that is crop diversity, part of that is cover crops, part of that is more effective irrigation systems, more efficient irrigation systems. Part of that is better seed technology with reducing reliance on chemicals and pesticides. Part of that is buffer strips and other conservation practices. So we're doing that. And then as part of that, we're reaching out to the international community, and we're saying, look, we need to share best practices. We need to share information as to how we can be better stewards. We need to open up the vaults of our research that we have at the federal government, and we need to make it available to the rest of the world. So we have a global open data for agriculture and nutrition initiative that's opening up our research so that people can use that research to come to better tools, better decisions, better strategies, better policies, not just in the US, but globally. And we're wrapping that into our Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance, where the US led an effort a year or 2 years ago at the United Nations, now over 100 members of this alliance, looking at best practices relative to climate and agriculture. So there's an aggressive effort now, and with the local and regional food system movement, with urban agriculture, with vertical agriculture, we're now beginning to see farmers. There's a farmer in Newark, New Jersey, who's growing leafy greens in a building, in an old warehouse. He's converted this warehouse. It's 30 feet high, 3 stories high. He's got leafy greens on trays all the way from the floor to the ceiling. He has them linked to computers, and there's an analysis of what's going on with each one of those trays, a different temperature, different nutrients being applied in different ways through sort of a targeted spraying technique with micronutrients. He believes, and he believes he can show and prove, that his facility is 70 times more productive than an acre of land in Salinas, California, where that same leafy green is being grown. So there's an awful lot going on in this space, and I think, what I'm hopeful is that we get away from being too judgmental about agriculture. I fear that, put yourself in the shoes of a farmer. I mean, most Americans don't understand this. Farming is, there are 2.2 million farmers in the country today, and that's a definition we use. That's anybody who produces more than $1,000 worth of stuff to sell. So that's a pretty broad definition. Of that number, roughly 2 million are producing less than $250,000 worth. They're smaller operators. In the best year we have ever had in agriculture, in terms of prices, those farms averaged $10,000 in profit. In the best year. Now, I guarantee you they're not averaging that this year. The commercial-sized operators are doing okay. They're struggling now, but they did very well during the good times. So it's really hard when you've got that diversity of income to a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. So, but when people say that there's a better way to do agriculture, that we need to stop doing this, and we need to understand the psyche that farmers have. Many of them feel sort of under attack. They think they're doing the right thing. They think they care deeply about the land, and they do. They care deeply about their animals, and they do. They take great pride in what they do. They think they're feeding us, and they're clothing us, and they're creating jobs. And they don't quite understand why there are as many people upset with them as there appear to be. So it's not to suggest that we shouldn't raise questions, and it's not to suggest that we shouldn't look for better ways to do things, but we need to figure out a way in this country where we can have that conversation where it's not judgmental. It's, I need to understand where you're coming from, you need to understand where I'm coming from. Let's get to a common place here. And I think when I sit down and talk to farmers, you know, the antimicrobial resistance, you know, farmers understand it and they appreciate the One Health approach. They don't necessarily want their sons and daughters not to be able to get well because we've built up this resistance. They understand they got to be judicious in the use. They understand they got to move away from growth. They understand using this stuff for growth. They understand that, and they're working their way through that process. But I think if you sit down, explain to them why we're doing things, give them time to adjust, they're pretty doggone creative and innovative. But there's a conversation that's taking place in this country now, and it's like everything else. It's a conversation that seeks to divide us into camps and into groups, and I really am trying to figure out how we bring people together. And if there's one thing that ought to bring people together, and historically has brought people together, it should be food.
Well, thank you. Let me thank Drew and the Kumpuris family for this wonderful lecture series. Stephanie, Ben, YJ, Molly for the partnership with the Clinton Foundation, our friends at AT&T who help us, and Nikolai DePippa with the Clinton School who runs the best college speaker series in the country. Thank you all. Thank you to the volunteers that help, and Mr. Secretary, for someone who grew up in small town America, your message hit home. Thank you very much for being with us.